The confession came without warning. Robert Martinez was talking about his terminal cancer diagnosis when he suddenly said 7 words and Oprah Winfrey froze. Those words made America's most powerful talk show host forget about cameras, ratings, and her legendary composure.
I gave away my son and I'm dying.
This wasn't just a confession, it was the beginning of the most emotional moment in television history. Because that day, Oprah did more than host a show. She gave a life back. 3 weeks before that life-changing appearance, Robert Martinez sat in his oncologist office in Phoenix, Arizona, staring at x-rays that looked like storm clouds. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 6 months to live, maybe less. The 52-year-old construction worker had faced many challenges in his life, but nothing like this. Is there anything you want to do? Anyone you need to see? Dr. Patricia Chen asked gently, closing his medical file. Robert's weathered hands trembled slightly as he thought about the one person who had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. There is someone, he whispered, but I don't know where he is. I don't even know if he'd want to see me. 20 years earlier, Robert Martinez had been a different man. Struggling with alcohol addiction, unemployed for 8 months, and facing eviction from their cramped apartment, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. His 5-year-old son, Michael, deserved better than what Robert could provide. The boy needed stability, opportunity, love from parents who had their lives together. Robert remembered that final day with crystal clarity. Michael had worn his favorite dinosaur t-shirt and clutched a worn stuffed elephant named Peanut. "Where are we going, Daddy?" the little boy had asked as they walked into the social services building. Robert had knelt down, looked into those trusting brown eyes, and lied for what he told himself was love. "We're going to meet some very nice people who want to be your family." The hardest part wasn't signing the papers. The hardest part was walking away while Michael called out, "Daddy, wait," from behind the glass doors of his new life. So Robert did what he believed was the most loving thing possible. He signed the papers and broke his own heart to save his son's future. Michael Martinez became Michael Thompson, adopted by a loving couple in Denver who gave him everything Robert couldn't. A stable home, college education, and the kind of childhood that Robert had only dreamed of providing. But with that gift came a price that Robert paid every single day for 20 years. The wondering, the regret, the questions that kept him awake at night. Robert had gotten sober 6 months after the adoption, but by then it was too late. The papers were signed, the records sealed, and his son was gone forever. He built a new life, remarried, even had 2 daughters with his second wife, Marie. But there was always an empty chair at their dinner table, always a missing piece in Robert's heart. Now with death approaching, that empty space felt bigger than ever. "I want to try the Oprah Winfrey Show," Robert told Maria one evening, as they sat on their back porch, watching the Arizona sunset. Maria looked at her husband with concern. They'd had this conversation before, in different forms during his darkest moments. "Honey, you know they get thousands of requests every day. What makes you think?" "Because," Robert interrupted, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "if there's anyone in this world who might be able to help me find Michael before I die, it's Oprah Winfrey. She's reunited families before. She has resources, connections, people who know how to find the unfindable." Maria reached for her husband's hand, feeling how thin his fingers had become. "And if she says no? If they don't pick your story?" Robert squeezed back with what little strength he had left. "Then at least I'll have tried. I need to try, Maria. I can't die carrying this regret." The application process took 2 weeks. Robert wrote a 4-page letter explaining his situation, his regret, and his desperate hope to make peace with his past before cancer claimed his future. He included medical records, the original adoption papers, and a single photograph, the last picture ever taken of him and 5-year-old Michael, both of them smiling at a carnival just days before the adoption. Against all odds, the call came on a Thursday afternoon. "Mr. Martinez? This is Jessica from the Oprah Winfrey Show. We'd like to fly you to Chicago next week. Oprah wants to meet you." Tuesday, October 15th. The Oprah Winfrey Show was taping its regular health and wellness segment. The theme was living with terminal illness, finding peace in your final days. Robert Martinez was one of 3 guests scheduled to share their stories about facing death with dignity. The studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy. Audience members filled 300 seats, cameras rolled into position, and Oprah Winfrey in her signature purple dress reviewed her notes one final time. But this wouldn't be a regular health segment. Robert sat in the guest chair, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The studio lights were brighter than he'd imagined, the audience larger than he'd expected. When Oprah walked onto the stage, her presence filled the room with a warmth that cameras couldn't fully capture. "Robert Martinez, everyone," Oprah announced to applause. "Robert, you've been living with pancreatic cancer for 3 months now. Tell us about your journey." For the first 10 minutes, the conversation followed the expected path. Robert talked about his diagnosis, his treatment options, and how he was preparing his family for the inevitable. Oprah listened with her characteristic empathy, asking thoughtful questions and offering comfort to a man facing his mortality. But then something shifted. "Robert," Oprah said, leaning forward in her chair, "when you wrote to us, you mentioned having unfinished business. Tell me about that." Robert's composure began to crack. This was the moment he'd both anticipated and dreaded for weeks. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. "Oprah," Robert began, his voice trembling. 20 years ago, I made the hardest decision of my life." The studio fell silent. Something in Robert's tone signaled that this wasn't going to be another typical guest story. "I was an alcoholic, unemployed, about to lose my apartment, and I had a 5-year-old son who deserved so much better than what I could give him." Oprah set down her note cards. In 22 years of hosting, she'd developed an instinct for recognizing when a conversation was about to become something bigger than television. "What did you do, Robert?" Robert looked directly into the camera, as if he could somehow reach through the screen to the son he'd lost 2 decades ago. "I gave away my son, and I'm dying." The words hung in the air like a prayer. The studio audience drew a collective breath. Camera operators continued filming, but everyone in the room understood that they were no longer watching a talk show. They were witnessing something raw, real, and potentially life-changing. Oprah Winfrey sat motionless for what felt like an eternity. In her entire career, she had interviewed presidents, celebrities, and world leaders. She'd heard confessions of abuse, addiction, and betrayal. But something about this moment, a dying father's desperate wish to reconnect with his child, hit her in a place she rarely allowed cameras to see.
"Oh, Robert," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion.
Robert broke down completely. His name was Michael. He was 5 years old, and he loved dinosaurs and chocolate chip cookies. "I signed the papers because I loved him, Oprah. I thought I was doing the right thing. But every day for 20 years, I've wondered if he's okay, if he's happy, if he hates me." The audience was crying now. Oprah reached across the space between their chairs and took Robert's hand. "And now you're dying and you want to find him." "I just want him to know," Robert sobbed, "that not a day went by that I didn't think about him. That giving him up was the hardest thing I ever did. And that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for not being the father he deserved." What happened next had never occurred in the history of the Oprah Winfrey Show. Without consulting producers, without checking with network executives, without following any established protocol, Oprah Winfrey made a decision that would change television history. "Stop the tape," she said quietly to her production team. Director Mark Williams looked confused. In 12 years of working with Oprah, he'd never heard her stop a taping mid-interview. "Oprah, we're live to tape. Stop the tape, Mark. Right now." The red recording lights went dark. The studio fell into an unusual silence as 300 audience members and dozens of crew members watched Oprah stand up from her chair and walk over to Robert. "Robert, look at me," she said, kneeling beside his chair. "What's Michael's full name?" "Michael Anthony Martinez. But his adoptive name would be Thompson. Michael Thompson." "And where was he adopted?" "Denver, Colorado, through Catholic Family Services." Oprah turned to her assistant, who was standing just off stage. "Get me Linda on the phone. Linda Jameson from our research team. Tell her to drop everything she's doing." What the audience didn't know was that Linda Jameson was Oprah's head of investigative research, the woman responsible for finding long-lost relatives, tracking down old friends, and locating people for surprise reunions. In her 15 years with the show, Linda had reunited hundreds of families. But she'd never been asked to find someone during a live taping. Ladies and gentlemen, Oprah announced to the studio audience, "We're going to do something we've never done before. We're going to try to find Robert's son, and we're going to do it right here, right now." The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the typical daytime TV excitement. This was something deeper, the collective hope of 300 people who had just witnessed a father's deepest pain and wanted to see it heal. Behind the scenes, Linda Jameson and her team were working at lightning speed. They had Robert's original adoption records, Michael's birth certificate, and the name of the adoption agency. Using databases that would make the FBI jealous, Linda began tracing Michael Thompson's life from the adoption forward. Meanwhile, on stage, Oprah sat with Robert and did something she'd never done before. She aired the search process live. "Linda, what do you have so far?" Oprah asked, through her earpiece, loud enough for the audience to hear. "We found the adoption records." Linda's voice came through the studio speakers. Michael Anthony Martinez became Michael James Thompson. He was adopted by David and Susan Thompson in Denver on March 5th. Robert gripped his chair arms. "Are they good people? Did they love him?" Linda's voice softened. "Robert, David Thompson was a high school principal. Susan was a nurse. They adopted Michael because they couldn't have children of their own. From what we can see in public records, they gave him a beautiful life. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home could have expected." "Oprah," Linda's voice crackled with excitement. "I think we found him." The studio went completely silent. Michael James Thompson, age 25, lives in Seattle, Washington. He's a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital. And Oprah, he's been looking for his birth father. Robert Martinez collapsed into his chair. 20 years of wondering, 20 years of regret, and his son had been looking for him too. "Robert, do you want me to call him?" Oprah asked. Robert couldn't speak. He could only nod. What happened next would become the most replayed moment in daytime television history. Oprah, with her phone on speaker, dialed the number Linda had found for Michael Thompson in Seattle. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. In those seconds, Robert aged another year. What if Michael didn't answer? What if this was their one chance, and it slipped away? "Hello?" A young man's voice filled the studio, clear and strong. Robert's breath caught in his throat. Even after 20 years, he recognized something familiar in that voice, an echo of the little boy who used to sing himself to sleep. "Is this Michael Thompson?" Oprah asked, her own voice trembling slightly with anticipation. "Yes, this is Michael. Who's calling?" The studio audience held its collective breath. 300 people had become witnesses to what might be the most important phone call of Robert Martinez's life. "Michael, this is Oprah Winfrey. I'm calling from my show in Chicago, and I have someone here who's been looking for you for a very long time." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Oh my God, is this about my birth father?" Robert burst into tears. "Michael," Oprah continued, "your birth father, Robert Martinez, is sitting right here with me. He's been looking for you for 20 years. "Dad?" Michael's voice cracked through the phone. "Dad, is that really you?" Robert leaned toward the phone, his voice barely a whisper. "Michael? Oh, God, Michael, is it really you?" "I've been looking for you my whole life," Michael said, crying now. "I hired private investigators. I registered with every adoption website. I never stopped looking." The entire studio was sobbing. Oprah wiped tears from her eyes as she witnessed something she'd orchestrated thousands of times, but never quite like this. "Michael," Robert said, "I need you to know something. I gave you up because I loved you. I was sick. I was broken. And you deserved better. But not a day went by that I didn't think about you." "I know, Dad. I know. My adoptive parents told me the truth when I turned 18. They said you made the most loving decision a parent could make." "Michael," Oprah interrupted gently, "there's something else you need to know. Your father is very sick." The phone went quiet. "How sick?" Michael finally asked.
"I have pancreatic cancer, son."
"The doctors say I have maybe 6 months." Another silence. "Then I'm coming to Chicago. Right now, I'm getting on the next flight." "Michael, you don't have to." "Dad, I've waited 20 years to meet you. I'm not waiting another day. Oprah looked at her production team and made another unprecedented decision. Michael, we're going to keep the cameras rolling. We're going to wait for you. However long it takes. What happened next had never been attempted in television history. The Oprah Winfrey Show extended their taping indefinitely. They fed the audience, brought in cots for crew members, and essentially turned their studio into a waiting room for the most important reunion of Robert Martinez's life. 7 hours later, Michael Thompson walked onto the Oprah Winfrey Show stage. But those 7 hours had been filled with the most extraordinary behind-the-scenes moments in television history. The production team had ordered dinner for the entire studio audience, 300 people who refused to leave despite having been there since noon. Crew members took turns napping on equipment cases. Oprah herself paced the hallways, checking her watch every few minutes, as nervous as she'd ever been in 22 years of broadcasting. What if his flight is delayed? She asked her producer for the 10th time. Oprah, he's coming. He said he'd walk to Chicago if he had to. The audience had become a family during those hours, sharing stories about their own lost loved ones, their own regrets, their own hopes for second chances. When Michael's flight finally landed at O'Hare, the entire studio erupted in cheers. The reunion was everything Robert had dreamed of, and more than television could capture. Michael was tall like his father, with the same dark eyes and gentle smile. He ran to Robert's chair and embraced him without hesitation. "I forgive you," were the first words Michael spoke to his father. "I forgive you, and I love you." Robert held his son and sobbed 20 years of regret into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I'm so sorry I missed your life." "You didn't miss it, Dad. You gave me life. Twice. Once when I was born, and again when you loved me enough to let me go." The audience gave them a standing ovation that lasted 10 minutes. Oprah, tears streaming down her face, stepped back and let father and son have their moment. But the surprises weren't over. "Dad," Michael said, "I brought someone with me." A woman in her 20s walked onto the stage, carrying a 2-year-old boy. "This is my wife, Sarah, and your grandson, Robert." Robert Martinez, dying of cancer and reunited with his son after 20 years, met his grandson who shared his name. The little boy looked at Robert with curious eyes and reached out to touch his face. "Hi, Grandpa," the toddler said in that precious way that only 2-year-olds can manage. Robert Martinez had thought he was dying alone. Instead, he discovered he was leaving behind a legacy. The episode aired 2 weeks later and became the highest-rated Oprah show in 5 years. But the real impact went far beyond ratings. Within days of the broadcast, Catholic Family Services in Denver was flooded with calls from birth parents and adopted children looking for each other. The show inspired legislation in 3 states to make adoption records more accessible. Support groups for birth parents formed in cities across the country. But for Robert Martinez, the impact was more personal and more profound than any social change. The man who had come to Chicago expecting to say goodbye to his regrets, instead found himself saying hello to a future he'd never dared imagine. Michael had taken a leave of absence from Seattle Children's Hospital to spend time with his father. Sarah had packed up their Seattle apartment and moved their little family to Phoenix temporarily. They rented a house with a backyard where Robert could sit in the sun and watch his grandson play. "I never thought I'd be a grandfather," Robert confided to Oprah during a follow-up phone call. 20 years ago, I gave up the right to a family legacy. But Michael, he gave it back to me. He lived for 8 more months, 3 months longer than doctors predicted. He spent those months in a miracle he'd created through the simple act of telling the truth on national television. He taught his grandson how to throw a baseball, read him bedtime stories, and filled 8 months with 20 years of missed love. The cancer couldn't touch those months, Sarah Thompson would later write to Oprah. Robert died surrounded by the family he thought he'd lost forever. He died at peace. Michael Thompson kept his promise to his father. At Robert's funeral in Seattle, he spoke about the courage it took to make the hardest decision a parent could make, and the miracle that brought them back together. "My father gave me up because he loved me," Michael told the packed church, "and Oprah gave him back to me for the same reason." Today, Michael Thompson runs a foundation called Second Chances, which helps birth parents and adopted children find each other. The foundation has facilitated over 500 reunions, inspired by the 8 months he had with his father. People ask me if I'm angry about the 20 years we lost, Michael says. But I'm not, because those 20 years taught me something important. Love doesn't disappear just because people do. Love waits. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, love gets a second chance. The Oprah Winfrey Show kept a photo from that day in their production office. Robert Martinez holding his grandson, while his son stands behind them, all 3 generations united by a miracle that started with 7 words and ended with a family made whole again. Oprah herself was changed by the experience. That day reminded me why I do this job, she said in a later interview. Not for the ratings, not for the fame, but for moments when television becomes something bigger than entertainment, when it becomes healing. Robert Martinez came to the Oprah Winfrey Show to confess his biggest regret. He left having turned that regret into his greatest gift. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go. And sometimes, just sometimes, they find their way back to you. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten, because Robert and Michael's reunion reminds us that it's never too late to heal a broken heart. It's never too late to say you're sorry. And it's never too late for love to find a way.